I stood in the middle of my parents' living room, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My mother's face was twisted in frustration, her hands gripping the back of a chair as if she needed something solid to hold onto. My father sat stiffly on the couch, his arms crossed, jaw clenched. And then there was Jake, my older brother, the reason for this entire disaster. He lounged against the wall, arms folded, looking smug like he already knew how this would end. "Are you serious right now?" My mother's voice cracked with disbelief. "You're really going to turn your back on your family? Over some money?" It wasn't just some money. It was everything I had worked for. My savings, years of hard-earned income, careful planning, sacrifices, wasn't theirs to claim just because Jake had screwed up again. "I'm not turning my back on anyone," I said, my voice steady, though my chest felt tight. "I just refused to bail him out. I didn't rack up gambling debts. I didn't take out loans I couldn't pay back. That's on him." Jake scoffed, shaking his head like I was being ridiculous. "It's not that simple. You wouldn't even have that money if it weren't for Mom and Dad raising you, supporting you all these years." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Supporting me? You mean like the way they covered your messes while I worked 2 jobs in college just to afford rent? Or how they drained my college fund when you got arrested and needed bail? Tell me again, Jake. What exactly do I owe you?" Silence. Jake's smug look faltered, but my mother jumped in, her voice shrill now. "We're a family. We take care of each other. If the roles were reversed, Jake would do the same for you." I turned to my father, the one person I had hoped would see reason. "Dad, you really think this is fair?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "Fair," he repeated. "Fair would be you understanding that your brother needs help. That we, as a family, do whatever it takes to keep each other afloat." I stared at him. That was it then. They had already made their choice. Jake was their priority, not me. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat and steadied myself. "If that's how you feel, then I guess I don't belong here." My mother gasped as if I had just slapped her. "Don't say that. This is your home." "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's not. Not anymore." The words felt final as they left my mouth, and in that moment I knew. This was the end of my place in this family. Jake smirked, knowing he had won. My mother's face crumpled, but she didn't stop me. My father just stared at me, as if trying to figure out how I had become a stranger to him. I turned and walked to my room, my hands shaking as I grabbed my suitcase from the closet. It was already half-packed. I had been preparing for this moment, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself. I threw in clothes, my laptop, the few personal items I actually cared about. I knew if I left anything behind, I'd probably never see it again. As I zipped up the suitcase, I heard my mother in the hallway. "You're being dramatic. You'll regret this." I turned to face her. "No," I said quietly. "I regret ever thinking I mattered as much as he did." For the first time, she didn't have a response. I walked past her, dragging my suitcase behind me. My father didn't say a word. Jake just smirked, shaking his head like I was the fool in all of this. "Good luck out there," he said mockingly. "You'll be back." I stopped at the door, gripping the handle tight. "I will never come back," I promised myself. "Not like this. Not on their terms." I walked out, stepping into the cold night air, the weight of their rejection settling on my chest like a boulder. For the first time in my life I was alone. And for the first time I was free. The night air was crisp against my skin as I stepped off my parents' porch for the last time. The house, once a place of warmth and familiarity, now felt like a stranger's home, one I had no business lingering around anymore. My fingers tightened around the handle of my suitcase as I walked to my car, the only thing in my name that they couldn't take from me. Sliding into the driver's seat, I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was unreadable, but inside a storm raged. Anger, grief, relief, all tangled together, making it impossible to tell which emotion would take over first. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life. There was nowhere to go, not really. I had an apartment lined up, a small studio I had put a deposit on weeks ago, as if some part of me had known this moment was coming. But at that moment, sitting in my car outside the home that had cast me out, I felt the weight of reality crash down on me. Had no family, no support system. It was just me now. I gripped the steering wheel, took a slow breath, and pulled away from the curb without looking back. The apartment was nothing special. A tiny one-room space with peeling paint and a questionable water heater. But it was mine. No one could take it from me. The first few nights were the hardest. The silence was different. It wasn't just quiet. It was hollow, like an absence I could feel pressing in from all sides. For years, even when I wasn't home, I had always known my family was there. Somewhere in the background of my life they existed. Now they didn't. I spent my first night on a mattress on the floor, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last conversation with my parents over and over. Their disappointment, their dismissal, the way Jake had smirked, so sure that I would come crawling back. I vowed that I wouldn't. So I threw myself into work. I picked up extra hours, poured everything into my job and saved every dime. There was a strange sort of freedom in knowing I didn't have to share my earnings with anyone. No guilt-tripping phone calls, no demands disguised as family obligations. Just me, my choices, my money. And yet, there were moments when the loneliness crept in. Holidays were the worst. The first Thanksgiving passed in a blur of takeout and TV reruns. Christmas came, and I convinced myself I didn't care. But when I saw families out shopping, laughing, sharing moments I once took for granted, a lump formed in my throat. I could have called. I could have reached out. But deep down I knew what would happen. They wouldn't apologize. They wouldn't see my side of things. I would be expected to crawl back, admit I was wrong, and hand over my money like a good daughter. And when Jake inevitably burned through it, we'd be right back where we started. I refused to play that game. Instead, I started building something for myself. A few months in, I got a promotion. Nothing major, but it came with a raise, and for the first time I could afford furniture that wasn't secondhand. I bought a rail bed, a couch, even a small dining table. Little by little, my apartment started feeling like a home. My home. One night, as I sat on my couch with a glass of wine, scrolling through my phone, I saw a notification pop up. A message from an old family friend. "Hey, I don't know if you've heard, but things aren't looking great for your parents. They might lose the house." I stared at the screen, rereading the words. I shouldn't have cared. After everything, after the way they threw me aside for Jake, why should their problems matter to me? And yet something in me stirred. Not sympathy, not regret, but curiosity. So I dug a little deeper. I made a few calls, talked to people who were still in their orbit. The story was the same everywhere. Jake had spiraled. His debts had gotten worse. And my parents, loyal to the end, had drained everything to keep him afloat. The house, the very same house I had been cast out of, was on the verge of foreclosure. I set my phone down, a slow, deliberate thought forming in my mind. I wasn't the same person who left that night. I had built something for myself. I had learned to stand alone. And now I had the power to change everything. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the legal documents spread out before me. The ink was fresh, my name bold on the deed. It was done. The house, the same one my parents had thrown me out of, the same one they sacrificed everything to save, was now mine. I should have felt something. Triumph, satisfaction, maybe even guilt. But all I felt was a quiet, unwavering certainty. They had chosen their path. And now they were going to walk it to the end. The moment came quicker than I expected. A week later, I received a frantic voicemail from my mother. Her voice was tight, teetering between confusion and hysteria. "Why you need to call me? Something is wrong with the house." A pause, a shaky inhale. "There's a letter. It says the property has been purchased." "But that doesn't make sense, The message cut off. I could picture it so clearly. My mother standing in the doorway, a letter clutched in her hand. Her mind struggling to piece together the impossible. The house was theirs. had always been theirs. Till now. A second voicemail came through an hour later. My father this time. Call me. His voice was flat, controlled, but I knew that tone. It was the sound of a man gripping the edges of his temper, trying to contain something much darker underneath. I didn't call. Instead, I drove by that evening. Not to gloat, not to rub salt in the wound, just to see. Their cars were in the driveway. The front porch light glowed against the night. For a moment, it almost looked the same as it always had. Home filled with warmth, with memories. But I knew better. The walls didn't hold safety for me anymore. They never had. I watched as the curtain in the front window shifted. My mother stood there, barely visible, her silhouette tense with worry. She was waiting, expecting someone else, maybe a lawyer, maybe a banker, someone who could undo what had already been sealed in ink. I didn't linger. I had no interest in a confrontation. Not yet. The real moment of reckoning would come soon enough. The next morning I finally answered. Hello. My mother's voice was raw, exhausted. I stayed silent, letting her sit in it for a second longer. It's you. A breathy exhale. Oh, thank God. Listen, something is terribly wrong. There's a mistake. There's no mistake, I said, my voice steady. I own the house now. Silence. A sharp, heavy silence that made my fingers tighten around the phone. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. What? I bought it, I said simply. The house was up for sale. So I bought it. Her breath hitched. You knew. The shock in her voice was almost laughable. As if it had never occurred to her that I was still out here, living my life, making my own choices. As if she had truly believed that when they cast me aside, I had simply ceased to exist. I waited for the shift, the moment her mind caught up with reality. And there it was. You did this on purpose. The warmth was gone now, replaced by something colder, sharper. You wanted this to happen. You wanted to see us suffer. Could have lied. Could have played the role of the misunderstood daughter who just happened to stumble upon an opportunity. But I was done pretending. You made your choice, I said, my voice unwavering. Now you get to live with it. A sharp inhale, the sound of her struggling to hold herself together. Then the anger came. How dare you? The words were venomous. After everything we've done for you. I laughed, a quiet, bitter sound. Everything you've done for me. I repeated. You mean choosing Jake over me? Throwing me out. Calling me selfish because I refused to set myself on fire for him. That's not. You expected me to suffer, I cut in. To fail. To come crawling back, begging for scraps. But I didn't. I built my own life. And now the house you threw me out of. It's mine. Silence. I could feel the weight of it pressing through the phone. You wouldn't, she whispered. I said nothing. She let out a choked, desperate laugh. You wouldn't actually kick us out. I almost pitied her then. Almost. But pity was a luxury I had long since stopped affording them. The eviction notice is real, I said simply. You have 30 days. A strangled noise escaped her throat. Please, she whispered now, all pretense of anger stripped away. This is our home. For the first time, something sharp twisted in my chest. Not regret, not guilt, but a small flicker of the love that had once existed between us. But love wasn't enough. It had never been enough for them when they cast me aside. And it wouldn't be enough now. You should have thought of that, I said quietly, before you threw me away. I ended the call. A deep, heavy silence settled around me. It was done. They knew. And in 30 days, they would know what it truly meant to lose everything. For the first time in my life, my parents had to live with the weight of their own decisions. And this time there was no fixing it. I didn't expect silence from them after that call, but for the next few days, that's exactly what I got. No pleading texts, no angry voicemails, just a void. I knew my mother was still struggling to accept it, probably hoping that this was some cruel test. That I'd come to my senses, show up at the house, and tell them I'd never actually go through with it. She didn't know me at all. It wasn't until a week later that the begging truly started. The first time I pulled into my driveway, there she was, sitting on the porch steps, arms wrapped around herself. She looked smaller somehow, defeated. I sighed, gripping the steering wheel before stepping out. The moment she saw me, she stood. "We need to talk." "No," I said, walking past her. She followed me up the steps. "Please. Just 5 minutes." I didn't want to hear it. I didn't need to. But some part of me, the part that still ached, still remembered what it once felt like to love them, nodded. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. She hesitated for a second before following me in. The house smelled different, cleaner. The air was lighter, no longer weighed down by years of unspoken resentment. I leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "Say what you need to say." She swallowed. "This house is all we have." A humorless laugh slipped past my lips. "And whose fault is that?" Her eyes glistened, but I didn't soften. "Not this time." "We were wrong," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Throwing you out, choosing Jake, it was wrong. But we didn't think. We didn't know this would happen." "That's the problem," I said. "You never thought. You never considered what I lost, what I suffered because of you. You assumed I'd always be there, waiting, desperate for your love." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "We're your parents. And that was supposed to mean something," I shot back. "But blood means nothing without loyalty." She flinched. I didn't feel sorry. "I wish we could fix this," she whispered. I studied her for a moment. This was the closest she'd ever come to an apology, but even now, it wasn't really about me. It was about their loss, their suffering. I shook my head. "You can't." Tears slipped down her face. "Where will we go?" The words sent a bitter ache through me. I had asked myself that same question once, standing on this very porch, locked out of my own home. But I hadn't been given an answer. I had figured it out on my own. And so would they. Exhaled. "That's not my problem." Sharp inhale. Like I had slapped her. But wasn't that what she had done to me? She stared at me, searching for something. Mercy, forgiveness, anything. I had nothing left to give. She turned, shoulders hunched, and walked out the door. I didn't stop her. As the eviction date crept closer, the silence turned into something else entirely. Desperation. My father, who had once prided himself on being the strong, unshakable head of the family, called me for the first time in years. "You've made your point," he said, voice tight. "It's time to end this." I leaned back in my chair. "End what?" "The charade," he snapped. "You've punished us enough." I let out a slow breath, pinching the bridge of my nose. "This isn't punishment. This is consequences." He scoffed. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" I wasn't. I thought I would, but all I felt was exhaustion. "You always had a home here," he continued. "You chose to leave." Anger curled inside me. "I chose to leave." "You're being dramatic." Clenched my jaw. "You told me I wasn't welcome. You locked me out of my own home. You threw me away for Jake." Silence. Then, in a much softer voice, "We thought he needed us more." Closed my eyes. "And what about me?" More silence. It was the first time he didn't have an answer. Exhaled. "You have a week left." He didn't argue. Didn't fight. Just let out a long, tired breath. "I hope you can live with this." And for the first time, I wasn't the one who had to. The day they moved out, I didn't go to watch. Could have. I could have stood in the driveway and seen the moment they left, forced to pack up their lives just as I had. But I didn't need to. I already knew how it felt. Instead, I sat in my car, parked a few blocks away, watching the sky darken as the last of their presence faded from my life. I had spent years trying to earn their love, their approval. And in the end, I had learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes, family isn't the people you're born to. It's the people who choose you. And if they never chose you, then they were never really your family to begin with. I sat in my car for a long time that evening, watching the last of the sunset bleed into the horizon. The street was quiet now, Empty in a way it had never been before. They were gone. And yet, I wasn't sure how I was supposed to feel about that. I had spent so many years craving their approval, longing for even the smallest gesture that told me I mattered. And when that failed, I had spent even more years trying to make peace with their absence. But nothing could have prepared me for this moment, the realization that it was truly over. I leaned back against the seat, my fingers tightening around the steering wheel. This was what I wanted. I had won. So why did I feel so empty? A part of me expected relief to come rushing in, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. But closure wasn't a switch you could flip. It wasn't instant or easy. It was slow, messy, and sometimes it didn't come at all. I turned the key in the ignition, exhaling as the engine rumbled to life. I needed to go home. Not just physically but emotionally. I needed to stop looking in the rearview mirror, waiting for someone to pull me back. Because for the first time in my life, no one was coming. And maybe that wasn't a bad thing. The first few weeks were quiet, peaceful even. Without the looming presence of my parents in town, I felt lighter, as if I had finally stepped out of a shadow I didn't realize I had been living in. But closure wasn't just about them leaving. It was about me learning how to exist outside of their choices. It was about waking up in the morning and not waiting for the weight of old wounds to settle on my chest. It was about unlearning the idea that love had to be earned. Some days were harder than others. There were mornings when I caught myself picking up my phone, my fingers hovering over my mother's number before I reminded myself there was nothing left to say. There were moments when guilt crept in like a slow-moving storm, whispering that maybe, just maybe, I should have been softer. But then I would remember the nights I spent alone, locked out of my own home, my hands numb from the cold. I would remember the way they looked at me as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience, a loose end they had long since cut. And the guilt would fade. I was done carrying their burdens. One afternoon, as I was sorting through boxes in the attic, I found an old photo album tucked away in a dusty corner. My breath caught as I flipped through the pages. There we were, our family before it all fell apart. In one picture, I was sitting on my dad's shoulders at the beach, my arms stretched out like I could touch the sky. In another, my mother was brushing my hair, a soft smile on her face. For a moment I let myself feel it, the echo of something warm, something almost like love. But nostalgia was a dangerous thing. It had a way of softening the sharp edges, making you forget the cuts beneath the surface. I closed the album and placed it back in the box. Some things weren't meant to be reopened. It wasn't until months later that I ran into my brother. I was at a cafe downtown, lost in my thoughts when I heard his voice. "Hey!" I looked up, my stomach twisting. He looked different, thinner, tired. There was no arrogance in his stance this time, no smug superiority, just uncertainty. I set my coffee down. "Jake." He shifted awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Didn't expect to see you here." I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because I'm supposed to disappear when you're done with me." He flinched. "I deserve that." I leaned back in my seat, waiting. He hesitated before sighing. I just wanted to say I get it now." I studied him. "Get what?" His jaw tightened. "What it's like to be on the outside." For the first time, he wasn't meeting my gaze with defiance. He looked ashamed. "They won't even answer my calls," he admitted, shaking his head. "Dad told me I was a disappointment. Mom said I ruined everything." A bitter smile tugged at my lips. "Took you long enough to realize what that feels like." He exhaled sharply. "I was stupid. I didn't argue." His eyes flickered to mine. "Do you think they'll ever forgive me?" I tilted my head. "Why do you care?" He swallowed. "Because they're our parents." I studied him for a moment. There was something in his voice, something raw and desperate. I had spent so long hating him, resenting him for everything he had taken from me. And now, he was just another casualty of their love. He sighed, looking away. "You don't need their forgiveness, Jake." His shoulders sagged. I stood, grabbing my coffee. "And neither do I." I walked out without looking back. Closure wasn't a moment. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a perfect, tied-up ending. It was quiet, subtle. It was waking up and realizing the hurt didn't control me anymore. It was knowing that I didn't need an apology to move forward. It was understanding that some people never change. And that was okay. 'Cause I had.